that the ATF authorized to be sold, and that the ATF said was legal up until the Biden administration.
Yes, there are people that are not using my product the way that I've designed it to be used, but the intent has always been that.
Take that same gun and put it in a 16-inch barrel. If anything, the muzzle velocity will be increased.
Well, Mr. Wilcox, there's no law. Congress didn't pass it. That's a rule from ATF.
Gives private citizens the right to possess a firearm, including a pistol.
President Biden has issued another executive order related to the Second Amendment, which is part of the fallout from the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This executive order is focused on reducing the number of guns sold without background checks and preventing firearms from getting into the hands of criminals. Proposed rule on reporting of explosive material storage. Title 11 of the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 added Chapter 40, Importation, Manufacture, Distribution, and Storage of Explosive Materials, to Title 18 of the United States Code. The Attorney General is responsible for implementing Title 11, which has been delegated to the Director of the American Firefighters Association. Regulations in 27 CFR Part 555 implement Title 11. In 1998, ATF published a final rule to implement a storage notification requirement for manufacturers and other storers of explosives. This regulation was amended in response to numerous endings and injuries sustained by emergency response personnel responding to fires at sites where explosives were stored without the knowledge of state and local officials. ATF is concerned with the safety of emergency response personnel responding to fires on sites where explosives are stored and the safety of the public around such areas. The regulation of 27 CFR 555.201F requires reporting of certain information when storage of explosive materials commences, but does not specifically require subsequent reporting that might reflect changes in the type of explosives and magazine capacity. The current regulation requires any person who stores explosive materials to provide an oral notification before the end of the day on which storage of the explosive materials commenced, and in writing within 48 hours of commencement of storage. Both forms of notification must include the type of explosives, magazine capacity, and location of each site where such explosive materials are stored. ATF proposes amending the regulation to require any person who stores explosive materials to notify authorities having jurisdiction for fire safety in the locality in which the explosive materials are being stored upon commencement of storage and every 12 months thereafter. Additionally, such persons would be required to provide written notification whenever they discontinue the storage of explosives. The proposed rule has been drafted and reviewed in accordance with Executive Order 12866, Regulatory Planning and Review, Section 1B, the Principles of Regulation, and Executive Order 13563, Improving Regulation and Regulatory Review. The proposed rule aims to address the storage of explosive materials in the U.S. based on Executive Order 13132. It will impact approximately 9,674 licensees or permittees, with the majority being small businesses. The notification process is estimated to take 30 minutes annually for phone calls and written notification, most likely by email, with minimal cost associated with the notification. The rule is not a major rule as defined by the Congressional Review Act and will not result in an aggregate expenditure of $100 million or more by state, local, and tribal governments, or by the private sector in any one year. No actions are necessary under the provisions of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995. The Paperwork Reduction Act requires a revision to an existing collection of information under the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995, including reporting, record-keeping, monitoring, posting, labeling, and other similar actions. The proposed rule amends 27 CFR 555.201F to require annual notification to local authorities having jurisdiction for fire safety concerning the storage of explosive materials. The need for information regarding explosive storage during fire response is crucial, as it can lead to potential explosions that could harm first responders and the public. The proposed use of information is to provide awareness of the existence of explosives in close proximity to a fire, prompting evacuation of the facility and surrounding area. Public comment on the proposed collection of information is requested to determine its usefulness, availability, accuracy, validity, improvement, and minimized burden. Comments must be submitted to the Office of Management and the Docket Management Facility by the specified date. ATF requests comments on the clarity, ease of understanding, costs or benefits, appropriate methodology, and time frame. Confidentiality is ensured by ATF, making all comments meeting the requirements available for public viewing at ATF and on the Internet as part of the e-rulemaking initiative, subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Commenters should not include material that they consider inappropriate for disclosure to the public. They must specifically designate any portion of the comment that contains material that is confidential under law, such as trade secrets or processes. Confidential information will be included in the rulemaking record but will not be disclosed to the public. Any comments containing material not confidential under law may be disclosed to the public, and the name of the person submitting a comment is not exempt from disclosure. ATF proposes rule to clarify firearm dealer licensing. The Justice Department announced it has submitted to the Federal Register a notice of proposed rulemaking that would clarify the circumstances in which a person is engaged in the business of dealing in firearms and thus required to obtain a license and run background checks. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, enacted June 25, 2022, expanded the definition of engaging in the business of firearms dealing to cover all persons who devote time, attention, and labor to dealing in firearms as a regular course of trade or business to predominantly earn a profit through the repetitive purchase and sale of firearms. On March 14, President Biden issued Executive Order 14092, which, among other things, directs the Attorney General to develop and implement a plan to clarify the definition of who is engaged in the business of dealing in firearms and thus required to obtain a federal firearms license. The proposed rule would amend the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives regulations by, among other things, conforming ATF's regulations to the new BSCA definition and further clarifying the conduct that presumptively requires a license under that revised definition. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed by Congress to reduce gun violence, including by expanding the background checks that keep guns out of the hands of criminals, said Attorney General Merrick B. Garland. This proposed rule implements Congress's mandate to expand the definition of who must obtain a license and conduct a background check before selling firearms. An increasing number of individuals engaged in the business of selling firearms for profit have chosen not to register as federal firearms licensees, as required by law, said ATF Director Stephen Dettelbach. Instead, they have sought to make money through the off-book illicit sale of firearms. These activities undermine the law, endanger public safety, create significant burdens on law enforcement, and are unfair to the many licensed dealers who make considerable efforts to follow the law. The Gun Control Act's exceptions to the license requirement exist to allow all law-abiding Americans to exercise their Second Amendment rights, not to facilitate the intentional evasion of the background check system. This new proposed rule would clarify the circumstances in which a person is engaged in the business of dealing in firearms and thus required to obtain a license and follow the laws Congress has established for firearms dealers. Federally licensed firearms dealers are critical partners to federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement in our shared goal of promoting public safety. They help keep firearms out of the hands of prohibited persons by running background checks on potential purchasers, ensure that crime guns can be traced back to their first retail purchaser by keeping records of transactions, and facilitate safe storage of firearms by providing child safety locks with every transferred handgun and offering customers other secure gun storage options. Unlicensed dealing, however, undermines these public safety features, which is why Congress has long prohibited engaging in the business of dealing in firearms without the required license.
That the ATF authorized to be sold, and that the ATF said was legal up until the Biden administration.
Every time I depress the trigger, a round comes out of the firearm.
So then why do you think it's okay for the ATF to come up with some rule with the force of law that Congress did not pass?
To increase compliance with the statutes Congress has enacted, the proposed rule identifies examples of conduct that would, in certain circumstances, be presumed to qualify as engaging in the business of dealing in firearms and thus to require a federal firearms license. And, in addition to implementing the revised statutory definition discussed above, the proposed rule would help to clarify the circumstances in which a license is or is not required by, among other things, adding a definition of personal firearms collection to ensure that genuine hobbyists and collectors may enhance and liquidate their collections without fear of violating the law. The proposed rule would also provide valuable guidance to the community of federal firearms licensees by addressing the lawful ways in which former licensees may liquidate business inventory upon termination of their license, and clarifying how a licensee can lawfully transfer a firearm to another licensee. Proposed rules to close gun show loophole. People selling firearms online, at gun shows and in other informal venues would be required to obtain a federal license to sell such weapons and conduct background checks on their potential customers, according to proposed rules by the ATF. The proposed rules aim to close what has become known as the gun show loophole, in which gun show sellers are subject to much looser federal regulations than vendors who sell at bricks and mortar stores.
But also, just from the standpoint of SBRs themselves, they were the loophole.
Well, Mr. Wilcox, there's no law. Congress didn't pass it. That's a rule from ATF.
An attempt to regulate a loophole while trying to essentially ban handguns.
Over time, that loophole grew to include people who sell firearms online. The rules would codify changes outlined in the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was signed by President Biden in June 2022 and was the nation's most significant gun control legislation in 30 years. The law expanded who was legally required to conduct background checks on gun buyers. ATF, which is responsible for regulating the sales and licensing of firearms in the U.S., was then tasked with developing rules that will make clear to gun owners how officials will implement and enforce the new gun laws. The rules aim to require most people who profit from selling guns to obtain a license. The rules, which could be challenged in court, will be finalized and enacted after a 90-day public comment period. Under long-standing federal law, people who operate gun shops or whose main livelihood involves selling firearms must register with the government to obtain a federal firearm license. This license requires them to search a federal database before selling a gun to ensure that the purchaser is not barred from owning one. The license also requires gun vendors to record the sale of each firearm, making it easier for federal officials to trace the gun if it is used in a crime. But people who claim that selling firearms is not their main source of income, such as people who sell guns at shows or in other more informal settings, were not required to obtain such a license. The 2022 law aimed to change that by saying that people selling guns to earn money must register for a license and record gun purchases and conduct the background checks that come with having a license. According to the proposed rules, anyone who sells a firearm through mail order or at flea markets, gun shows, and online must register online and conduct the necessary background checks. There are some exceptions, including for hobbyists who are selling firearms from their collection and people who sell firearms they inherited. This proposed rule implements Congress's mandate to expand the definition of who must obtain a license and conduct a background check before selling firearms. Attorney General Merrick Garland said in a statement, "There are about 100,000 active FFLs in the country, according to federal data. It's hard to know how many people are selling firearms without licenses, but ATF officials estimate that if the rules go into effect and people follow the law, it could increase the number of license holders by tens or even hundreds of thousands." A senior administration official said applications for those licenses have not increased or decreased since Congress passed the 2022 law, but prosecutions involving illegal dealings of firearms have increased by 52% since 2021, officials said. ATF Director Stephen Dettelbach said the rules should clarify who must apply for a license and who qualifies for an exception. An increasing number of individuals engaged in the business of selling firearms for profit have chosen not to register as federal firearms licensees as required by law, he said in a statement. Instead, they have sought to make money through the off-book illicit sale of firearms. These activities undermine the law, endanger public safety, create significant burdens on law enforcement, and are unfair to the many licensed dealers who make considerable efforts to follow the law. Earlier this year, ATF issued rules that would apply more security checks on gun owners and sellers who use unregulated stabilizing braces to effectively transform pistols into more deadly rifles.
The pistol brace doesn't change the caliber of the pistol, doesn't make it more powerful.
Makes the firearm more concealable and therefore more dangerous is laughable.
That there are as many as 40 million pistol braces in the United States.
The National Rifle Association and other gun advocacy groups sued the Biden administration in response, saying that such a rule change would need to come from Congress. The lawsuit is pending. Biden administration proposes expanded background checks for firearm sales. The Biden administration is proposing a rule that would require thousands more firearms dealers to run background checks in an effort to combat rising gun violence nationwide. The proposal comes after a mandate from President Joe Biden to find ways to strengthen background checks following the passage of bipartisan legislation on guns last year. People who sell firearms online at gun shows or other places outside brick-and-mortar stores would be required to be licensed and run background checks on the buyers before the sales under the rule proposed by the ATF. A firearm industry trade group swiftly raised concerns about the proposal, though, and said it could face a court challenge if finalized in its current form. The Bureau estimates that the rule would affect anywhere from 24,500 to 328,000 sellers. It is aimed at those who are in the business of gun sales rather than those with personal collections. Background checks help prevent guns from being sold to people convicted of crimes, teenagers, and others who are legally blocked from owning them, said the agency's director Steve Dettelbach. Federally licensed firearm dealers are also required to keep records and sell guns with serial numbers, both of which help law enforcement trace weapons used in crimes. Unlicensed dealers sell guns without running background checks, without keeping records, without observing the other crucial public safety requirements by which the federally licensed firearm dealer community abides, he said. Attorney General Merrick Garland said Congress passed the gun legislation to reduce gun violence, including by expanding background checks, and said the new rule implements that mandate. Overall, stricter gun laws are desired by a majority of Americans, and in particular background checks, regardless of what the current gun laws are in their state, according to a recent AppNorc poll on guns. That desire could be tied to some Americans' perceived impact of what fewer guns could mean for the country, namely fewer mass slayings. As of Monday, there have been at least 33 mass killings in the U.S. so far in 2023, leaving at least 163 people slayed, not including slayers who ended, according to a database maintained by the AP and USA Today in partnership with Northeastern University. 3 black people were slayed to demise by a white man wearing a mask and firing a weapon emblazoned with a swastika in Jacksonville, Florida. The slayer, who had purchased the weapons legally despite previously being involuntarily committed for a mental health exam, ended himself. The legislation last year Congress passed was the most comprehensive gun control in 30 years, and it followed a horrible mass slaying in Uvalde, Texas elementary school. The 2022 law toughened background checks for the youngest gun buyers, sought to keep firearms from domestic violence offenders, and aimed to help states put in place red flag laws that make it easier to take weapons away from people judged to be dangerous. Biden has said the law doesn't go far enough. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said the administration would continue to push for more gun control.
To pass universal background checks, eliminate gun manufacturers' immunity from liability.
So you're saying to me that a law that Congress passed 90 years ago allows for 10 million Americans to become felons today?
None of this absolves Congress the responsibility from the responsibility of acting.
Proposed rule to modify federal firearm dealer definitions and background check requirements. Since 1994, federal law has required federally licensed firearm dealers to conduct background checks before selling or transferring a weapon. These background checks have prevented over 3 million felons, convicted domestic abusers, and other dangerous individuals from acquiring guns. However, there have been cases of individuals avoiding the requirement to obtain a license for selling firearms, effectively bypassing background checks. In response to this issue, Congress passed bipartisan legislation last year, signed by President Biden, to modify the definition of who needs to become a federally licensed firearm dealer. This legislation aimed to better protect the American people from gun violence by clarifying when someone is supposed to become a licensed firearm dealer. As a result, the Department of Justice has now announced a proposed rule to specify the new definition in the Safer Communities Act. If finalized, this rule would have several implications. 1. Individuals who are not selling guns for profit, such as selling a gun to a family member or engaging in firearm-related hobbies like collecting curios, relics, or collectible personal firearms, would not require a license to sell firearms. 2. If someone offers firearms for sale with the intent to make a profit and tells customers that they can purchase and sell additional firearms, they would presumably need a license and be required to conduct background checks. 3. Repetitively offering firearms for resale within 30 days of purchase would also trigger the need for a license. 4. The proposed rule includes other scenarios where individuals would be presumed to require a license in civil and administrative proceedings, absent reliable evidence to the contrary. The proposed rule aims to clarify who should be considered engaged in the business of dealing firearms, and thus required to become a licensed firearms dealer and conduct background checks. The rule is now open for public comments, and the Department of Justice will consider these comments when finalizing the rule. Proposed ATF rule and presidential call for gun control legislation. The proposed rule also specifies that engaging in activities such as creating a website or business cards to advertise or market a firearm business, maintaining records to document profits and losses from firearm transactions, purchasing business insurance, or renting space at a gun show would be presumed to indicate an individual's primary intent to earn a profit. Furthermore, the rule explicitly states that there are no legal loopholes for gun shows or internet sales. Regardless of where they conduct their firearm purchasing and selling activities, including at gun shows and online, dealers engaged in firearm sales are required to obtain a license and conduct background checks.
Their restriction under the NFA has always been irrational.
Yes, there are people that are not using my product the way that I've designed it to be used, but the intent has always been that.
The Department of Justice will consider the comments it receives during the public comment period when finalizing the rule. Following the finalization of the rule, there will be a subsequent call to Congress for action on this matter. This rule is expected to significantly reduce the percentage of firearms sold for profit without background checks. While it builds upon previous efforts by the Biden-Harris administration to address gun violence, the president continues to urge Congress to pass legislation that mandates universal background checks, enforces common sense measures such as banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, requires safe storage of firearms, and ends liability immunity for gun manufacturers. These measures are seen as life-saving steps to combat the ongoing gun violence problem. The ATF has also released a statement clarifying the definition of a federal firearms license and the need for such a license to sell firearms, emphasizing that it must be obtained from the federal government. Concerns over changes to FFL requirements. The proposed ATF rule has raised concerns among gun owners and enthusiasts. Under the existing federal law, individuals engaged in the business of selling firearms are required to obtain a federal firearms license and conduct background checks on buyers. However, the proposed rule seeks to clarify and expand the criteria for who should be considered engaged in the business of selling firearms. One of the key points of contention is the expansion of what constitutes engagement in the business of selling firearms. The proposed rule suggests that even individuals who sell firearms on a more occasional basis, such as making a profit on a gun sale or selling a firearm within 30 days of purchase, may need to obtain an FFL and conduct background checks. This potential change has raised concerns that it may infringe upon the rights of gun owners to sell firearms legally and without undue restrictions. The proposed rule also outlines certain activities, such as creating a website or maintaining records related to firearm transactions that could trigger the presumption of an individual's primary intent to earn a profit. This further complicates the definition of who should be considered engaged in the business of selling firearms. Additionally, the proposed rule clarifies that there are no legal loopholes for gun shows or internet sales. It emphasizes that dealers engaged in firearm sales, whether at gun shows, online, or elsewhere, are required to obtain an FFL and conduct background checks. The concerns raised by gun owners and Second Amendment advocates revolve around the potential overreach of these changes.
I would say virtually all of them are owned by law-abiding citizens.
Take that same gun and put it in a 16-inch barrel. If anything, the muzzle velocity will be increased.
Gives private citizens the right to possess a firearm, including a pistol.
Critics argue that these proposed modifications could infringe upon the rights of law-abiding citizens to engage in lawful firearm transactions and could lead to unintended consequences. It's important to note that the proposed rule is open for public comments for a 90-day period. The Department of Justice will consider these comments before finalizing the rule. Following finalization, there may be further discussions and actions in Congress related to these changes. In summary, the proposed ATF rule has sparked concerns about potential changes to the requirements for obtaining an FFL and conducting background checks when selling firearms. Gun owners and advocates are closely monitoring these developments and actively participating in the public comment process to express their concerns and opinions on the matter. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.